Welcome everyone on this, I won't even say what it is, this evening. The University of Manitoba campuses are located on original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Just before I introduce Marc, I'd like to say if there are any architects in the audience, the MAA sign-up sheet is at the back. So, Marc Ryan, Public Work, Toronto. I just met Marc 3 minutes ago. So, of course I used the wonderful world of the internet to put together this introduction. In late 2014, the Globe and Mail, I actually need some light. The Globe and Mail presented Marc Ryan and Adam Nicklin of Public Work in their 5-part series subtitled The New Radicals. Though they began to work together in 2006, they were working for 2 different firms, Marc for West 8 and Adam for DTAH in Toronto. The project they were working on was the Central Waterfront in Toronto that many of you I know are familiar with, and all I say to you is think wave deck. The success of this project inspired Ryan and Nicklin to launch Public Work. Interestingly, English-born Nicklin had been working for a Canadian firm, and Toronto-born Ryan was working for West 8 in Europe. They both agreed that a firm devoted to the public realm could be based in Toronto, and Public Work was then created in 2012. Marc graduated from landscape architecture at the University of Guelph in 1999. He worked with Richard Haig Associates in Seattle, design workshop in Denver, urban strategies in Toronto, and for West 8 Toronto, where he was the studio director overseeing the Central Waterfront and Governor's Island in New York City. Yesterday, in my last theory class, lecture of the year, I restated conclusions from 1997 from my PhD. So I see the students in there going, oh no, not again. The first conclusion was, landscape is process, not object. Students and practitioners are only ever intervening in a process, creating a new point in a process rather than a fixed end stage. The second, landscape architecture is a contextual discipline. To my delight, and I quote from the Globe and Mail article, quote, looking closely at the context is something we're really interested in, Ryan says. We evolve our designs by looking closely at things. We dig into and celebrate the unique characteristics. The article goes on to describe Jubilee Square in Fort McMurray, which includes a deck that can be moved around the site on a track tracing the path of the sun. Public Work are focused on the intelligent evolution of the contemporary city, a breed of public spaces that are deliberately conceived and designed to continually evolve over time rather than as finished compositions. Their work seeks connections with the particular qualities of the place and explores the experiential and social dimensions of environments designed for active use and engagement. They are dedicated to guiding public realm design, planning and infrastructure projects at multiple scales, so they relate powerfully to their context and enhance the quality and experience of urban life. Public Work score high as a wonderful Canadian practice that works to emulate these central aspects of landscape architecture. Landscape is process, not object. Landscape architecture is a contextual discipline. And of course, they score high in awards for their project, the Bentway, which is the first project to win 3 CSLA awards in 1 year. And of course, they score high in my theory class. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Marc on this windy, snowy, rainy Winnipeg April evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Marcy. Wow. I'm going to clip that back on. How's the sound? Is that okay? Great. Marcy, thank you. That was a really nice introduction. Now I feel like we've known each other for a long time. And thank you for the invitation. It's so nice to be here. I was just telling my former colleague Alyssa Schwan that this week was actually a celebration with Adam and I, my partner in practice, of 7 years of public work. So I was actually thinking about talking about sort of a little bit more about some directions of the work, but I thought actually I wanted to just reflect on the last 7 years and look at actually projects individually over those years, and maybe we might just discuss sort of that evolution and again this theme of process and work in progress, because we're really a young office and we're really figuring things out and we're really exploring, and that's part of I think what I love about the profession is that it's a constant series of discoveries. This is a picture that is very grainy, but that's a picture of Adam and I standing on top of the skeleton of a future Spadina or Simcoe wave deck on the central waterfront. So that brings back, Marcy, you told that sort of story really beautifully. Thanks for sharing that. But that sort of is the foundations of that collaboration with my partner, Adam. And we started the office back in 2012, as you described, and really happy to say Melissa Tovar is here today with her beautiful daughter Esme, and Melissa was one of our early colleagues and longtime collaborators at Public Work. Now she's back in Winnipeg, in your glorious city, so that's kind of exciting for me to see her again, and her offspring. Here's a view of the studio. This is sort of where we all come together, and I think one of the things that was really interesting about what I learned in the culture of the Netherlands working at West 8 was how a multidisciplinary practice formed around the medium of landscape can work together. And our colleagues in the studio are all from different backgrounds, a mix of landscape architects, urban designers, architects, and civil engineers. But all, I think the thing we share in common is the object of our obsessions and our energies and our love is really the landscape and the public realm. And we're focused on cities, particularly Toronto, and in the idea of how that city is evolving. And to me, like my whole lifetime has sort of observed Toronto sort of starting from this moment, and a kind of obsession in how it could build itself towards the sky, almost as a measure of its stature as a global city. And it's been interesting to sort of see that play out over the decades. And in the last 20 years, we've seen the city sort of move from a state that looked like this to a state that's more like this. And that's happened surprisingly fast. And I never get tired of sort of seeing that transformation. If you don't get to visit the city on a regular basis, it feels like that kind of shock sometimes. So the question for someone interested in the public realm is to actually take stock of the city as it is today, at this moment, now that we've achieved a relative verticality, and actually start to focus on the things just beyond this view, the sort of, in a way, incredible natural heritage and resource that is actually woven into the city fabric, and to start to really think about this idea of a city as a landscape and what that means to recover that, or to make connections to that in different ways at different scales. And so that has been really, I think, the kind of part of the mission of public work. And I'm just going to go through a number of projects. The first one is actually one of our longest running projects in the office. It's still unbuilt, but it was our first project in 2012. It's at the mouth of Garrison Creek in Toronto. It is ready for tender, so I'm excited that one day it will be constructed. But on the left, you see this site at the shoreline of Lake Ontario and the mouth of Garrison Creek, right next to Fort York, about 300 or 200 years ago. On the right, you see the site as it is today, now with landfill moving at about 400 meters from the lakefront. And the site has this incredible kind of sense of time, backwards and forwards as it straddles a landscape that was on the left and the landscape that is emerging with the construction of condos in City Place neighborhood. And in archival imagery, we recall the kind of actually really strong landscape form of the promontory at this particular site as this creek rushed out into the lake and formed this promontory and this kind of cliff, strong cliff edge. This is sort of the site today as it is sort of abandoned now next to rail, next to a large viaduct of the Bathurst Street Bridge. And on the other side of that bridge is sort of almost trapped is Fort York National Historic Site. And technically this land is actually a part of that 42-acre National Historic Site, but most people have no idea. It's just a real hole, a dark hole in the city. But there's an interesting sort of story behind this place, which is really the story of one of Toronto's many lost creeks, in this case Garrison Creek. And the clues or the signs of this creek are really hard to find, as it was, like many of the creeks and the watersheds which covered the downtown area of Toronto. Those watercourses have kind of disappeared over time, channelized, put undergrade into stormwater infrastructure. But at this point, at this moment, in this public space, and in capturing the kind of eastern side of Fort York, we put forward the idea of almost reestablishing the artifact of this sort of geomorphological figure, and to almost take quite seriously this sketch, which is from Elizabeth Simcoe, about that promontory embankment, and to explore also new, I would say, ancient construction techniques in landscape, earth building techniques, which somehow amidst the kind of steel and glass of this condo development and this kind of vertical community, we lose a touch with a more tactile kind of earthen sense of the landscape. So we're proposing kind of a use of rammed earth and then really trying to recover some of the textures of this creek ecology, and use the stormwater of management techniques in the lowlands area to reestablish that creek-like texture and atmosphere. And this is sort of a view of the sort of diagram of the site, of this sort of division of a lowlands, a middle cliff kind of edge, and then a highland and promontory green on top that would offer kind of unparalleled perspectives of the district. So I'm just kind of, thank you. Thanks, Madeline. I'm sort of toggling through the varied sections of the construction of this landform and path through the kind of cut of the rammed earth cut, and how we start to hybridize sort of that embankment as also a kind of historical artifact, but also a place for play to integrate much needed kind of community features of the neighborhood. This is a neighborhood that has yet, a lot of people have moved in, but this was the first park they had a hand in talking about and discussing and working together and collaborating on. And so community sort of play for children was a big theme in discussions. And so we're able to sort of work at how both a historical narrative and then this kind of play narrative could be woven together. Here's one of the images of how we start to show that passage from the trails along the rail bank could actually allow the underside of the Bathurst Viaduct to become more hospitable, to kind of increase the kind of porosity between both sides of the fort, and then ultimately have the climax of this upper green, which would give you a prospect over Bathurst back to the fort to create a kind of a dialogue between this location, which was one of the reasons the fort was established here, and then the fort and the remains of the heritage of the fort itself. 2013, we got involved with the University of Toronto faculty, the Daniels Faculty of Landscape, Architecture and Design. They were planning a move of the faculty to 1 Spadina Crescent, which was the former Knox College. This kind of flat, circular roundabout space with this incredible jewel of a historic 19th century building. This building had been abandoned and disused for a number of years, but it had gone through many progressions of uses. The idea was to reestablish all faculties, including the School of Visual Arts, in this new building, and the architects were Nader Tirani's firm of Nada. Just situating that Spadina Circle in the historic context of Toronto's fabric, it's really one of the few exceptions to the rule of the grid. So it's a very interesting kind of break in that morphology of the city. That and Queen's Park are sort of one of the two really poignant ones. And here's the site today with that opposite view. What's really interesting is that the Knox College building was very formally looking down south, down Spadina to the lake, but really disregarded the northern vantage point up the street. And the new addition actually creates a much more multivalent kind of side and edge condition to the north, south, east, and west. And that was sort of one of the key kind of urban and landscape gestures, to start to look at the evolution of that site originally as a landscape in the late 19th century before the construction of Knox College, with this kind of very axial kind of break of the parterres, and then how it started to emerge over its deterioration to a sort of single-sided orientation. And the idea really of the building and the situation of the new extension was to allow that to be a little more responsive in four directions. And so this was the plan, which has been really interesting to see how it kind of moved from an illustrative plan through the detailing, and then today this kind of aerial image of how the strong figure of these kind of islands that start to galvanize around the old building, the historic building, break through the transitions, and then reestablish with more topography towards the north. So here's the sort of figure. This is the eastern side of the project, which is actually the front door, and that is oriented to Russell Street, which is one of the key axis spines towards the center of U of T. So that opening of a front door to the east and a kind of gateway to the campus in that direction was key. That's also the sort of the location of the plaza and the kind of focal point of gathering. Without, of course, giving up on any of these other sort of more neighborhood-focused entrance on the other side of Russell to the neighborhood, the formal historic south, and then the more dramatic and contemporary northern facade. So each axis has its kind of own kind of personality, respectful of the heritage, but also kind of how that evolves around this circle. Because the circle is always seen in movement, which is really sort of the dynamic aspect of it. And that sort of figure ground that we establish with these parterres is heavily influenced by topography. That south view is now sort of presents itself very formally with this kind of native grasses and this idea of reintroducing nature into the city, but in a very respectful way, very tuned sort of to the pastoral kind of moment and these kind of quiet contemplative moments. The preservation of heritage trees was sort of really critical, and then to just bring this kind of influx of new textures in planting. As you kind of weave around the circle, so to speak, you come to that entry court, and then the introduction of much more inflected topography. And in fact, sort of reaching a climax sort of as you come around this moment where the streetcar comes, and the sort of most dramatic landform kind of almost sets itself off with the edge of the most dramatic kind of point of the building. And we call this landform Darwin's Hill. It's sort of almost an exception to the rule of these very sculpted and tailored kind of landforms in a very controlled building. In a sort of spirit of almost like letting the landscape a little bit loosen up. This area is actually a very dramatic constructed landform. It's constructed out of the negative sort of soil repository of the cut to create a sunken terrace on the north side, and kind of demonstrates sort of like this subtraction and then addition of this, sort of this digging out is actually sort of a way to start to allow the whole northern part of the circle to take on a much livelier, expressive, and sculptural kind of feel. And that's an interesting kind of action because it starts to make a completely flat kind of landscape feel a little bit bigger than it actually is in a strange way. It has that sort of perception of becoming a more complex landscape in a relatively small, basically 1 acre site. The construction of Darwin's Hill was interesting. It also allows a chance to sort of expose different forms of construction as a pedagogical tool. The construction of varied degreed slopes and stabilization methods of forming those slopes, and of course borrowing from mechanically stabilized earth techniques common more in engineering practices to allow those to be visible. That's the construction of sort of the layering of construction of this 5.5 meter high landform. You start to see in construction, that's the south-facing slope that would face the plaza that becomes the lawn, the sort of sun lawn. And on each side of this landform, we were able to sort of set forward the beginnings of some pedagogical experiments in landscape that the faculty would be involved in being custodians of. The first one was very simply a taxonomy, so to speak, of the City of Toronto's native and approved trees for naturalization. So that's A to Q of trees, and they face the studios. So for landscape students who it's very interesting to sort of be surrounded. Your campus actually much more lush campus. The U of T campus very central in the city. Landscape students don't have the same access to actually looking at trees in the same way, and to see trees also through their growth, their various sort of periods of growth. So it's sort of nice to think of a student who might spend 3 years at the faculty actually to be able to observe these various species in different moments and following their form and habit as they go. And then the south side is really the lawn, which we've been experimenting with mowing and not mowing. And the kind of regime is being established of how that maintenance practice will take on. We've actually had a lot of fun in thinking about how this landscape is maintained, and especially at Darwin's Hill, how we allow natural processes to sort of unfold a little in a more open way without the strict maintenance practices of the university. Across the site, you can see various methods of reinforcing soils at different slopes. Slopes are designed in very kind of clear and concise ways. So there's a kind of tour you can take around the circle, and you can catch about every kind of standard slope that you need to. So if you're working on a project, you can see a 3-to-1, a 2-to-1, a 1.5-to-1, a 1-to-1, and that sometimes is a nice measure to really understand spatial conditions. And here's a view of the landscape again, sort of with the sense of varied textures that start to come around as you go around the block. And you notice Darwin's Hill starts to stand out as the woolliest. Incidentally, the grass is sort of a placeholder for a terraced timber seating element that will have future funding. But this is some of our team from Public Work. Actually, we were doing some tests in seeding some stock of Vinca, just to see how they would take. We were doing some bare root plantings and just some various tests that were interesting to see what densities we could establish on this steep, mechanically stabilized slopes. So then this is the north facade. We're seeing again the kind of, I'd say, kind of exciting kind of juxtaposition of very manicured grasses of various kinds of fescues, always sort of trying to create different types for students to observe. And then the steep slopes of the North Terrace. There they are again. And this is a kind of connection to the inner Fab Lab areas of the university. Here's moving around again to the west entrance. This is more the community side and the library and the more contemplative side. This is where yews and birches become filter landscapes on either entrance. The scoring of the concrete, because of the, for the budget, the paving was really poured in place concrete. But to give it a sort of more life and quality, so it didn't feel like the rest of the kind of concrete city that surrounds it, we employed a scoring technique that was kind of inspired by some of Sol LeWitt's drawings. Just this kind of like etched, very careful overlapping line work. And we discovered that amazingly, in Guelph, Ontario, there's sort of a North American leader of scoring, but this is not employed usually in public space projects. It's usually for barns. It helps cattle from slipping, to prevent cattle from slipping in barns. So amazing guy named Vern, who is in high demand in Texas ranches, came to U of T to do this amazing kind of incisions in conjunction with control joints and expansion joints to create this kind of varied densities across the ground plane. And it was a kind of moment of a little bit of fear, especially for the dean, as this perfectly, you have one shot, Vern's at the, at the machine, and you have this beautiful white concrete. Anyway, so there's a view, sort of again, how the circle gets repositioned in the city, reestablishes sort of new relations to its edges, and the landscape continues to evolve. The faculty continues to play a central role in how it's managed and how it will be a source of kind of experimentation going forward. 2014, we were really lucky to get involved in a project of very high density, 2 new office towers by Wilkinson Air Offices, architects. And they had the idea of bridging these 2 towers with a park. And that bridge, or that platform that would connect these 2 projects, allowed the project to kind of work in phases, because while the first building was built and occupied, the second was a sort of staging ground for building the second one on a very tight plot of land. But I guess one of the other really strong purposes in the landscape was to redefine what it meant to sort of extend the quality of the downtown's kind of office addresses south of the tracks past Union Station. And in some ways it was really about how that financial district, which is fairly underserved in terms of green space, would begin to sort of have a green address. And that was, I think, really important because the sort of general center of Toronto's business address has always been King and Bay. And at King and Bay, that's where Mies created one of his iconic TD Towers. And it's a real question of how you start to move that energy southward to south of Front to this address, and then even further south of the tracks to this address. And part of the theory or the principle, or what we started to work with, was to create a kind of corporate environment that would be completely different from that of King and Bay, and basically the opposite, and to focus around, so sort of actually the disconnect from the ground plane and city level by necessity, because this park was 5 stories above street level, that it could actually absorb a kind of unprecedented kind of panorama and access to the sort of skyline views, and that it could be materialized in sort of a way that was really nothing like that of the kind of granite ground plane of the financial district traditionally. So as you enter the park, from either vantage point, you kind of meet a garden, and then you're kind of drawn into the sort of central green. And part of that was sort of driven by an idea about a park 5 levels off of the city ground, and what it would mean to activate it, not just from the office users, but how it actually could play a role in more daily life. And that's a real challenge at 5 levels above street level. We worked also with the sort of advisors who work on Bryant Park in New York City, who have been sort of become kind of adept at programming public realm spaces. They were sort of part of the discussion and dialogue with the client team about how you create a kind of central zone that could accommodate almost anything, and then the ability to sort of keep programming and activating edges. And what was interesting in the conversation from us as landscape architects was actually to sort of work at the nuances of those assumptions about flatness being sort of the default for infinite programming, but actually to recognize that a landscape didn't have to deter flexibility in terms of programming, so that tree planting didn't have to mean that you couldn't still have a farmer's market, or that you couldn't start to think about animation in an environment that could be actually still have character from a point of view of a landscape. And that meant also really having a lot of discussions about topography, and that actually placemaking and sort of programming are things that actually have to work together. The use of wood and timber was really important for us in sort of, again, like counteracting the kind of glass and steel nature of so much of this area, and letting it feel like a place where you might want to take your shoes off. And so the sculptural timber detailing of this bleacher that would face the lawn. This bleacher actually started to turn into more than just a landform and a sort of source for the garden, but it also became a kind of functional building, and it evolved into sort of this approach to topography that underneath this particular hill, the landform has actually kind of found its I guess, raison d'etre from the point of view of the clients, especially by housing a kiosk that could serve food and beverage, washrooms for the park, mechanical room, storage, and a garage for Zamboni. I'll get to the skating program in a moment. Interesting from point of landscape architects working on a park, it evolved into actually designing a landform that eventually became a building. And so that building is almost completely in disguise as one of the sweeps of this kind of botanical drifts. In terms of the species mix of like more deciduous trees with diverse kind of seasonal color framing the transition to the buildings, with sort of thickets of native birch that come around the front. Ideas about the gardens that are really promoting biodiversity and pollination, and this kind of image of a sweep of green that actually like moves through the park. So a few more views. And again, that idea of programming, this plan had to be tested for a sort of infinite number of scenarios of how this could be occupied, both by office users, but also the programming that they anticipated to keep this place kind of pulsing. It's right across from Scotiabank Arena, so they saw it as actually a place that would have heavy kind of event action. And it accommodates an ice rink seasonally at its core, so that's another reason for the facility here to store the Zamboni. Okay, I'm going to keep moving to 2015. This was an exciting year. This was when we had the amazing opportunity to engage in this kind of fantasy, so to speak, about how our remnant infrastructure of the 20th century could take new life in the public realm, which starts to only become, I think, particularly in Toronto, becomes really a hot topic as we reached a certain tipping point in density. It's a kind of there's now, I think, a more commonly held understanding of, the feeling like we're lacking our connection to green space and public space, and it starts to actually mean a lot to people, and it's really become central in the public discourse. And actually, this project's been really a great stimulus for that discussion. We were really thrilled to be invited by urban designer Ken Greenberg to start to explore what it could mean to think about a public space under this artery. And one of the sort of principal ideas was really about both working under this roof, but also working with this structure. And that was something that was really important to us. Without a doubt, its placement strategically in the midst of 7 neighborhoods that hadn't really galvanized as one. The structure, sort of how it kind of just swerves through neighborhoods, some established, and extremely historic, others completely new, but housing a huge population of people without really a strong sense of a community kind of gathering place. So it kind of began through an idea of connectivity, but it really evolved to an idea of place and a particular kind of activation or kind of place that was very different than the traditional parks of the city, and that could kind of be an antidote to supplement the kind of traditional spaces that you might have in various parts, whether it's a historic commons of the fort, the kind of more traditional community parks, the waterfront kind of parks that have been emerging across here. The Bentway became an idea about really an alternate kind of space that was really more about expressing a kind of creative arts and the sort of diversity of culture that Toronto doesn't always have a home for. In looking at this space, it's sort of one of those spaces that just its rawness is what makes you fall in love with it. These amazing shots of it under construction reveal its kind of anatomy of these columns, which are called bents as an engineering term. And immediately from this view, you almost get a kind of sense of that anatomy, and the idea of rooms emerged. And what was really super exciting is the idea that within this phase of the project, that you could think of this as a collection of 55 individual rooms, or on the other hand, you could think of it as a nearly 2-kilometer space, sort of like no other in the city. And that kind of ability to oscillate between sort of feeling like an aggregation of many small things, or on the other hand, these kind of big sweeps, was really exciting. And sort of that elasticity of the space was something that we really didn't want to lose. And I think like our approach in thinking about what to do with this, or how to take this place a step further, was really about how we could be true to almost what we had found, and to really amplify those qualities when you visited it often, and when you saw it. As sort of one of the things, the quality of light, the quality of the majestic nature of the scale, and the rawness and sort of brutalness of its materials. So the kind of palette of both green and hardscape emerged as a kind of woven strategy, where vegetation was really about pioneering, spontaneous, and kind of really a little bit wild, while materials were aiming to be warm from this abundance of concrete, to try to find a sense of warmth. And to do that, I also to try to avoid the sort of instant feeling of newness, to actually try to sort of bring a soul to the place. And there was a kind of patina about some of the structure that actually had a real beauty. And it was our intuition that in working with more recycled materials, that would be a sustainable thing to do, but also could bring a kind of character and identity to the place. So we had the good fortune of being able to work with the Toronto Region Conservation Authority to harvest some of the materials from Tommy Thompson Spit, which is the place. This is one of the kind of most amazing landscapes in Toronto, if you ever have a chance to visit. This is basically the detritus of cities, the last 100 years of cities' construction debris, being basically eroded and washed on the shoreline. We were able to kind of capture one of the last loads of dumping at the Spit before it went to the beach, and sift through it, and then create our own kind of mixes that were these sort of Bentway mixes, and use them as aggregate in the concrete on site. And so in some various ways, that sort of like legacy of the city is kind of built into the new project. And that quality of light, one of the really interesting topics with working with our lighting designer, Linnea Tillett, was not just about the quality of light at night, which many lighting designers talk about, but rather the quality of light by day, and the sort of reflectivity of the place. One of the sort of most important moves we've had was to add very selectively a kind of gold paint across some of the bents to sort of amplify that amazing light, as especially that setting sun, at the end of the day. And the other thing was in all of our kind of materialization to use galvanized metal as a sort of like coherent, to create coherence, but also for its reflectivity, its simplicity, and to sort of disguise old and new, and the kind of utility of a certain infrastructure with also other additions like signage and rigging. So here's a view of first phase completed last summer. And really the theory and principle behind the thing was about not just the design of the environment, but actually rather how we could support life in this environment. To actually a project about how you just design the kind of equipment to allow things to happen in a place. And in some ways that was how we conceptualized the sort of various components of the place based on their proximity to stable neighborhoods or proximity to rail and kind of noisier conditions, to sort of create these three kind of districts in the plan. And what we've seen has been really exciting, that the kind of life of the place has been fueled by really diverse community programming. And it's just kind of, it's just kind of like on a regular basis feels like it's really renewing itself. The kind of materialized, some of these places are very pioneering in their finish. The furniture is really robust and chunky, and it just allows like almost the minimum to allow things to happen and allow other people's imagination to do more. There's a principle about really thinking about multifunctionality, but not necessarily revealing what it becomes. I mean, this is of course, but in some months it's a trail and a sort of multi-purpose trail, and then in winter that becomes the skating rink. But the edges are designed so it doesn't look like a kind of sad skating rink in the summer. So they're really like that kind of blending has been kind of one of the sort of focuses of design. Here's the sort of west end of the project near what we call Strawn Gate, where the kind of grading, again, a process of salvaging or not shipping away fill material to landfill, but rather keeping it on site and using that landfill to sculpt seating and amphitheaters for performance venues, sort of looking underneath the roof here at Strawn Gate for the kind of informal gatherings that are taking place, and then the kind of seating that surrounds it for larger gatherings. This is a view from the summer. And I think one of the almost like signatures of the project is really how the bents themselves are the supports for the project. An idea about how you can harness the kind of amazing opportunity of having a roof at a scale that you would never have in any other park. And this idea to think of like that undersign as hosting kind of scale of rigging that we would have never imagined. And so working with our structural engineers at Blackwell to think about how a rigging system could be suspended from those columns in an appropriate way to allow artists, visual artists to install different three-dimensional works, to also support kind of canopies and screens and various things. So there's a whole set of detailing around the columns to allow things to be attached and kind of rigged in, almost the way you'd approach a theatrical kind of design. So here's a view of Strawn Gate, and in the rendering underneath that we have a community room, washrooms, and more storage, and a green room for performers. Here's a view of that top. The top is a deck that allows you to descend from Strawn Avenue into the project. These sort of baffle walls, a pivot. They have art installations on one side, and they kind of mute sound a bit from the street when it's in performance mode. Some of the new trails that lead into the project. And generally sort of how, what's interesting is sort of how simple the project is really, and it's just like almost trying to do the least to allow it just to sort of take on life. And that's, I think, an interesting theme, and as we, when we reuse infrastructure from the last century and find new life for it, like how our approaches to sort of the lightest means possible to allow the greatest kind of advantage for public life is really an interesting theme. The other thing that's remarkable about the project is its funding. This was the unprecedented gift of $25 million from Will and Judy Matthews here in this image, whose generosity allowed the Bentway to happen from the point of view of the capital investment of building what I just showed you, but also from the perspective of seeding the conservancy, the Bentway Conservancy, which is based on a similar model like the New York Central Park Conservancy, and which is more common in the US. But to have actually an independent body that can maintain and activate the space on a continual basis. So it's and in collaboration with the City of Toronto. So it's really kind of an amazing story, and what the Bentway Conservancy does now is really they're custodians of the place. So they're in charge of setting up all these kind of amazing events and activities and engaging the community, and quite remarkably also visual artists from around the world. And we saw an exciting installation this fall by Dan Rosgaard, a light artist from the Netherlands. And it was a chance to really imagine how the space could continually get reinvented by others, in fact, and that in some ways our role as designers in this case was to be as discreet as possible to allow the conditions for future things to happen. Marcy, you let me know if I'm getting close to time. I'm going to show. Okay. I'm going to move fairly quickly through TO Core, although it's a really complex project. It's not the one that you can really explain in a short amount of time. It's sort of our biggest urban design project that we've had, and it comes back to this image about that condition that Toronto has found itself in, of having built up a lot of density and not necessarily built the corresponding public spaces to support that. And ratios of parkland per person are often produced by the parks departments, but this was a chance to really work in collaboration with the city, planning, urban design, and transportation to think for the first time in 40 years to make a comprehensive vision for downtown Toronto's open space, parks and public realm. And in doing so, this was a chance also for us to sort of pull back, to look at the city a little bit from a distance, and to remind ourselves of what we already have. And I think sometimes we can get, we've been in such a habit of always thinking of starting from scratch, but our intuition was that it was in the interconnection of some of the resources that we already had and how we could weave those in a more profound way, we might actually be able to regain that better balance, I think, between, in some ways, our kind of fundamental morphologies of the city, the sort of natural systems of the landscape, and the kind of the colonial grid that was overlaid on top of it. And it's sort of the interaction between those that has always been at odds in the city in Toronto. But an image like this starts to almost set the kind of challenge maybe for the next 30, 40 years about how we could re-articulate the kind of that exchange between our natural systems and our urban systems. And I think that's a really key topic of design that you can approach actually at many scales, not just at this one. So I'm going to talk about one of the big scale gestures that was like kind of central to the project, and that was started sort of from this overlaying of the kind of primary colonial grid over this map of our real natural systems. And in many ways, a lot of those systems have disappeared. But if we start to look sort of almost like an X-ray of what some of the sort of skeleton of some of the key open spaces, we can start to see the formation of almost a kind of ring. And it's a ring that actually includes some of, like a collection of probably our most diverse landscapes and ecologies that include the Don River Valley to the east, the sort of peninsula and sand shifting islands to the south. This is the Garrison Creek corridor, which we talked about, mouth of the Creek Park, which is right there. And that lost creek that we could also recover, we promote being recovered through the linking of existing parks and new streetscapes. And then the northern line, which is a really sort of the geological trace of our city, former shores of Lake Iroquois, and really important from indigenous perspective as a traveling route from 400 years ago. And together, actually, that's a collection of 900 hectares. And in a conversation that shouldn't just be about quantity of open space, it really should be about quality, it's also interesting to remind ourselves that we are encircled by a size of green space that's 3 times Central Park. And in some ways is about shifting our kind of even our imagination about what it means to live in the core and move outwards towards this landscape, and likewise to live beyond that and move towards this as a system around us. Next sort of really key topic is streets. And streets are kind of, next frontier really for rethinking public space design. In just looking at some of the key, like the 12 key streets and the right-of-way, we have almost 500 hectares of terrain. So we did a proposals for 12 of the city's most important streets. And I'll just really quickly talk about one, because it's indicative of kind of philosophy about approaching them, and it's University Avenue in Toronto. This is what it was in its glory years towards the end of the 19th century. Here it is today. It is an important design modern landscape, but at the same time, this kind of orphaned island in public life studies really did not perform well. As it sits, it's a 3-acre piece sort of stranded between heavy traffic. We propose the kind of reconfiguration of and narrowing and reconfiguration of lanes of traffic to expand that park and stitch it to the east side, stitch it to City Hall, Osgoode Hall, and the courts, and link it up to Queen's Park, and then into King's College Circle and U of T. And you see the kind of aggregation of area grows to over 65 acres. And this is really not like a trick, it's just simply thinking about our open space resources or our streets as connecting existing open spaces, and then allowing them to work as a kind of assemblage of places. And so, yes, we create a street that feels like a 9-acre park, but what it unlocks is a kind of system that's much more significant and allows a sort of civic precinct around City Hall to move into this judicial thing all the way up to Queen's Park, where Queen's Park and the university suddenly, are in dialogue. And that approach really could be taken in, we've outlined about 20 different places where you could have that thinking. We call them park districts. It's not a great name, but it's passed by City Council and it's in the official plan. But so it's a really exciting achievement, and it's looking at things not as singular elements of the public realm, but actually as woven. And that's a big step in thinking. And there's all kinds of examples. This is in the Garden District, trying to bring it back to its glory. Maybe no one knows where the Garden District is, but that's Allen Gardens, if you know it. That's Moss Park, set to be transformed. And there's a whole series of streets that can actually start to perform more like park streets as a sort of typology, and that your experience of the park doesn't have to end at the traditional boundaries of that space. And then there was a few parts of the planning study that actually, sometimes generate a more political interest, and they kind of advance a conversation. And one was at Rail Deck Park, and this was probably one of the few moments maybe in downtown where we could actually create a large park, and that would be a park in a place that you normally couldn't build, and that's over the railway tracks. So this is Bathurst Bridge. This is where the future Creek Park will be. Really a once in a lifetime opportunity to make a 21-acre park. Again, it's not Central Park, but in the area to the north at King West, which is really one of the most dense districts in the country, it has a strong meaning. I won't talk about the last scale, but that's one of the most interesting. It's like how a big city also can take on its small scales, the lanes, the little leftover interstitial spaces, and also think differently about schoolyards, churches, cemeteries, etc. And that all starts to form sort of a more nuanced strategy in a big book. I don't think there's a lot of time to go on, and I have like 2 more years to cover. But I think I should stop. But this one I might just very brief, like I might just briefly. But this was a competition we did. A lot of people say that, right? I'm going to stop, but I'm not keep talking. If we go 5 minutes, is that yeah? Okay. This project, we did this. We were really excited to participate in the competition for Nepean Point in Ottawa. This is such a loaded site statue of Champlain sitting on a promontory along the Ottawa River, and if you pull out, of course, like it's directly staring at the Parliament buildings, directly behind the National Gallery of Canada, the Center for Global Pluralism of the Aga Khan. One of the most important landscapes in Ottawa, if not the country. And this competition was hosted by the National Capital Commission in 2017. So as a reminder, that was during the year of celebrations of Canada's 150th birthday. Of course, that for us was a huge red flag and a real call to question all the kind of assumptions, as we are as a nation having to do in these times. And of course, it was a year of reflection and a year of deep transformation for us as a nation with the findings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So given our understanding that virtually every aspect of Canadian culture would have to be reconsidered, it seemed difficult to sort of move ahead as a status quo, continuing the picturesque of our capital city. And all of these sort of things which have been in the news and play were happening right towards the end of the competition. And for us, it became impossible to avoid a sort of almost counter proposal to the project that was really took a kind of, I think, tried to take a leap for the NCC beyond the continuation of that 19th century picturesque approach to park making in the capital, and to really start to suggest an alternate path. And for us, that meant like immediately engaging with an elder, John Bocage, as a guide in the process, and to actually kind of reframe a question that had nothing really to do with the brief per se, but was really more about trying to explore what could be the foundations for a 21st century park for all Canadians, and what might that look like, and how would you actually set that in motion. And I think what became clear under John's guidance was the impossibility of a singular answer to that question, and more so about how we could frame a dialogue that could maybe sway the NCC into a different way of thinking. So, there's incredible research about and exploration with John about symbols in Indigenous culture, spirituality, leading to sort of spatial organization and venues for dialogue, and how those universal symbols are also spatial places in all cultures. And most potently for us as in landscape, of how the synergies of sort of ecology and thinking about the natural world could find a kind of common ground. We were particularly taken about the idea of succession as a kind of sort of model of healing, and how actually the process of kind of from a state of disturbance, how an ecology regenerates itself. And on the site, it was interesting this is a site where the exposed limestone bedrock of the cliffs kind of are almost suggesting these kind of process landscapes, and sort of how kind of the emergence of a new ecology comes from scratch, or it comes from bare ground. So our proposal really was reframing some slightly different ambitions for the project, but trying to take on the challenges that the brief also put out. And one of those was to transform the way you get to Nepean Point. But the brief had a preconception that should all come from Majors Hill Park through a bridge. We didn't think that created the most drama for a sense of arrival, nor expressing the real relationships of this point to its source of the river. We discovered there was in fact a lower route that was used a little bit by joggers that didn't go up to the point, but nevertheless did part of that route. And so we actually started to think of the route to Nepean Point having an alternate approach from the locks, along Rideau Locks, and then up along the escarpment. So to think actually of the route being in sort of 19th century Ottawa, moving down to the river, which is the source, for the region, climbing up, and rather than this sort of the drama of climbing 6 meters and having the same vista all the way along, opening up a much more dramatic route that's very immersive in contact with the water and then rises dramatically up and around and gives you a much more kind of holistic understanding of that approach. So to think of the bridge not of crossing the street like the competition had outlined, but rather to follow the river and to make its way up in a kind of serpentine way up along the escarpment in close contact with this exposed limestone. And so a bridge that would actually pin itself into the rock foundations and then weave up to the top. And then sort of handling this very sensitive situation with Samuel Champlain, we pursued an idea that was actually, because of the sort of contaminated fill that was found here from the environmental studies and because of the asbestos in this little washroom building, we proposed a complete excavation of the site down to bedrock, which was actually underlain quite shallow when you started to look at boreholes, and to, in some ways make a very literal break from the kind of line of 19th century picturesque park landscapes from Major's Hill up, and then define and actually reclaim the kind of riverfront and edge that would actually be almost the beginning of a kind of source landscape from bedrock. And then to allow that to be just exposing the fabric of the limestone, and then allowing sort of almost in some ways half a park to be created, and the other half to be a grounds for a whole different sort of process of park making that actually had nothing to do with the NCC or us, but was really kind of an open-ended idea of how over time the kind of breakdown of mineral, the formation of nutrient-rich soil, and then slowly the cultivation of life could occur. And we were moved both by Cornelia Oberlander's Tega Garden in the National Gallery right next door, and also Nicholas Galen, indigenous artist's installation on some of the bedrock of these carving, and how that is already giving life to sort of new growth, that we imagined that actually a kind of whole different approach to custodians and interaction with the bedrock could be kind of created by participants in sort of shaping this landform and allowing over time it to kind of evolve. And of course, a key part of that is putting the custodianship also back with the Algonquin Nation in collaboration with partners from education, as well as the National Gallery and others, community organizations, to sort of allow this to unfold. And then I think symbolically and importantly, moving Samuel Champlain to the edge in a still a really great view of the river and the Parliament, but not as the central central figure, and sort of still honoring that dialogue and those narratives, but putting them in balance. So in the previous condition, he was on the highest ground in this one central spot that everyone went to survey the land. And then in the new park, it really opens up this point as actually a piece of the riverscape, and that's really, really at the core of Ottawa and the nation. And in kind of as a counter to the Confederation Drive circuit that's really at the kind of highland benchmark, it would create a new river route that actually would follow the shoreline, where this place would be the climax of those two, an intersection of those two. So the challenge, of course, was representing this idea that's really a challenge. I mean, it's a sort of partly the challenge of landscape, how to express time, how to express process and change over time. And to actually look at an image like this and say that this isn't a final image. This isn't actually what we want. This is just what we might begin. Maybe I think I'll just stop there. Yeah. Thanks.
Anything after 2019, or is that?
That's it.
That's it. No.
That's
Thank
it.
you so much. I enjoyed all of it, and I would have sat here for 20 minutes longer, but I saw a bit of shuffling. Does anyone have any questions? Comments? I think I'm supposed to run and get this to you.
I just wanted to commend you on the presentation.
Bye, Andy. Bye, Melissa. Bye, Esme.
It's one of the best I've seen in here, and I've seen an awful lot. So I commend you. I think your illustrations have been very effective in getting conceptual landscape information across effectively. So I just wish the rest of my architectural colleagues were here tonight. I grew up in Toronto professionally, so I know every site you're talking about. So I only have two questions. One dealt with the Daniel School of Architecture, the Spadina site. That seems to have been a very tightly integrated project. Can you elaborate on just how that was done in terms of design?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it happened maybe the coincidence of a dean beginning his tenure at the faculty who was a dean from an urban design background, in this case, Dean Summer. And so being very focused on the urban project, if not more so than the landscape or the building itself, to think of what was the urban move. And then hiring an architect, Nader Tarani, who was really interested in a building and a landscape. And so we had a very willing participant from point of view of a client and an architect to think about integration and push that to, as far as we could. And of course, a project for a faculty means like you're also dealing with a lot of designers and so challenging. But of course, like high aspirations and where if you're introducing dialogue about integration, sort of in a school that sees itself as trying to express that integration, it was a good environment to be exploring these kinds of things. But I'm glad that reads in the project. I think it was the most balanced kind of exchange between building, landscape, and sort of that I've ever worked on personally. And I also, what I find sort of interesting is that it has many personalities. There's sort of moments where it's a very supportive landscape, very kind of, it has humility, and then there's also moments where it's very expressive. And I think that shift to me is what's like I kind of find gives it a bit of its personality. That it has these different dimensions. But anyway, I don't know if that answers.
No, it starts. There's a particular interest. We're in a place where we're just supposed to be interdisciplinary, and we're supposed to develop those skills and instincts in students in all departments. So I would think there are many lessons that we could draw from that kind of work, because there are so many factors involved that involve expert input and reconciliation. So that would be my. The only other question I had was, is it safe in the garden these days?
Yeah, well, I should have mentioned the precondition to that opportunity was that gardener, as you know, built in 1958 or something, really had not been maintained since that time. So it was crumbling, and of course, hence the whole discourse about does it come down, does it come up. This part was already fate. Its fate was to stay, because the city had done the rehabilitation of $1.5 billion right up to Bathurst. So it was like the tip of the iceberg. The city had, public money had already invested in making this safe. Nothing will fall on you. All the, it's all rebuilt for another 70 years, whatever. And that allowed that investment, I think, to have a return. That's the sort of strategic layer of it that when you think of how the public realm and infrastructure could be coupled, that sort of following in the wake of that massive investment that basically would have no return other than cars that could continue to ride on it. That was, I think, what was so appealing, especially to the mayor's office, and at the time, John Tory, to his credit, welcomed that opportunity and that gift from the Matthews. And part of what made that thing move was because of that donation and the interest of the mayor's office in facilitating expediently the delivery of this project. But that's also why it doesn't go further, because the next rehab over the next 7 to 10 years will go eastward.
Maybe a student from here.
So as you know, a lot of the landscapes or concepts that you do in landscape, as you said, landscapes always change and they have to be maintained. So when presenting like a project to like a client, do you also explain to them, or do you have to develop any sort of method to like how the landscape should be maintained or taken care of throughout the years?
It's a great question. Yes is the answer, and it's something that I think is becoming now not a thing you can avoid any longer. I think a long times a beautiful image was enough to sort of like, okay, we'll worry about it later. A lot of cities, park departments really aren't equipped in the way they maybe once were. They're not funded in the same way. It really changes, I think it changes you as a designer and what your object is and how you think about that. To think of tuning your landscape also to the maintenance, an understanding at least of maintenance and potential maintenance. And yes, in conditions where you're trying to do things that are beyond a sort of normal level, I think it's about educating a client about how they do steward this landscape. That was the case in a number of projects that we're working on, and also you're having meetings with the teams, like for example at university departments who will be maintaining the landscape. You're talking about how you'll do it. You're making schedules for them. You're elaborating how that's done. There's a project we're working on which is actually a housing project, and it has really elaborate roofscape with sort of unprecedented levels of soil volumes supporting amazing biodiversity on the roofs, and this is going to be maintained by the condo board. So right from the start, there was a huge amount of discussion about how would that be done, how much would it cost, so that they would like either agree with that or disagree with that. Fortunately, this client was really progressive, and they're committed to that, and it's all kind of legally encoded in everything they've done to construct this particular building to support this. The irrigation systems, the sensors that are going to monitor it, even down to the kind of crazy arms, like Canada arm kind of things that are going to come from the roofs to allow window washing and gardeners to kind of maintain. So it's a subject of design, I guess is the answer. Yeah.
Anyone else?
I just had a question about kind of in relation to the Ottawa project, and it's maybe a bit of a broader question, but what do you think is the responsibility or the role of landscape architecture or the work that you do in creating and constructing Canada, which is maybe very broad?
It's a great big question. It's nice to ask a good place to ask a big question. I mean, this is a place for big questions. Are you studying landscape? Yeah. Well, Matt, like what year are you?
I'm actually a session instructor.
Oh wow, okay. I think it's a question when I'm not prepared to answer yet, but I think it's the kind of question that should be a kind of back of the head framework for, like for practice. Because I think I've never really thought of it like in those terms personally, but because we've been working so centrally in work in Toronto, I have thought about it a little bit in terms of our like working in the particular city where I live and grew up and now work. So I do feel like there's at whatever scale you're talking about connecting to a place or an idea, I think that's central in sort of like both your motivation and then also just your decision making, because it's like, how do you make decisions to yourself, or how do you make decisions, not just to your clients, but how do you make decisions to yourself? What drives you? What fuels you? And I think that conception personally can be at many different scales. I love that you just jumped to our national scale. I think we should all be there, and we should be down here, and we should have it here. But like, let's call that one to be continued. I hope you're asking, and that's really cool if you're engaging with that with your students too, because hopefully that would come.
Any other questions? Oh, sorry.
I'm thinking.
No, that's going to be a Department of Landscape Architecture here. Welcome. Delightful presentation. Thank you. I can start a debate on the event, but I won't. I'll keep that for further discussion. But I'm interested about the particular context of working in Toronto, because it is really a city of the future, because it's the most ethnically diverse city in the world, I believe, right now. So the question, really is it possible to truly design public spaces, or full public spaces in such a diverse environment? How do you approach that? Do you believe we can still do that in true, fully public space?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's kind of like maybe a Toronto dialogue that is happening and needs to continue to happen. I think we can continue to add the public dimension to every component of the city that we can. I mean, that's. I think there will always be forces that are going to be excluding things, but I think I think it's kind of a mission of Toronto, if it is in this league of diverse global cities, that it has to be exploring what it means to be an inclusive city. We have in some ways become such a polarized city, and there's famously two cities, and the downtown core is very different than the suburbs, and that's systematically exported poverty. So it's not a simple answer, but I think the public realm is a place that is a meaningful place to start, and that's just where my belief is, and I think that we, like, as a practice, we hope to be doing more work outside of the core to address some of the balancing of the city as a whole, that can tap into more of the diverse cultures of our city, because they're not all downtown.
I'd argue that wherever you are in Canada, what is it to design in a multicultural country? I mean, I talk about this with students all the time, because in some respects, if I'm in Belgium, it's a little bit easier to know what those symbols and myths and values that people have, especially toward the landscape. But in Canada, what is it when you're dealing with so many different people coming together, and First Nation people? So it's such an interesting, important topic. Sorry, Brenda? Anyone else? Ted, come on, you always ask a question.
Well, I mean, we could just follow up with, what's implicit in that last question about the public. I mean, there's cultural diversity, and then there's class conflict. And you alluded to it. You're obviously aware of it. So your work is in line with the High Line in New York City. Some of the projects are touching on these kind of spaces that are recuperating infrastructure. Even in the Pean Point, you go under that bridge that connects Quebec and Ontario. So those projects were, of course, presented as recuperating the former industrial landscape, greening the city, creating open public space. But in fact, they were just phase one of a real estate scheme that has turned into, you know, like the High Line eventually will be dark again because of all the signature Startech towers, right? And it becomes a real estate trigger. And I don't know, the designer, what is the role of the designer in maintaining, of sort of trying to build into the design the possibility that a project could remain truly public and not become a private, you know, island that's inaccessible to the public. I don't know, like, in my view, one of the only things we can do is to say no to projects or just take a stand when we see it happening. But it's very difficult, right?
Yeah.
Have you found yourself in a situation ethically where you had to speak up or try to find an alternative to avoid this, setting up that scenario of gentrification?
I mean, I think the Nepean was one of those cases for different reasons, but it was a diversion from what the question being asked. And but I think with the Bentway, it's actually nothing like the High Line. It's misunderstood as maybe being more similar. The real estate, the adjacent lands were pre-developed. They're all built. This was actually a gift of generosity that came down to a kind of underserved area to provide something that the city sort of couldn't do on their own. And so the real estate play, unlike the High Line, is relatively over on the Bentway. But it still has challenges, and it's working through those. But its mandate is different. It's really connected to. It's in collaboration with the city, the Conservancy, and the city. It is a public space. It's not a private space. It's built on public lands, and the donor had no intention of self-interest. It's not called the Matthews Bentway. You know, it's a very, very, very different. And I think that's what's almost impossible for Americans to imagine when we talk about the Bentway in New York, because we're in this High Line network. The Bentway is part of this network of all these other linear infrastructural projects. But it dumbfounds people in U.S. cities to think that this was created in this way, in this model, because it doesn't land in that same sort of capitalist model that you described. But anyway, I think like what you're raising is a huge kind of barometer of like practice. So, I mean, yeah, I don't have an answer.
I mean, like an example currently being used in the UK is where they're exposing the so-called affordable housing, council housing, where they had the playground for the rich kids. And
Right.
suddenly, it's one thing to have the corridor, and it's another thing to have the playground and not be accessible, even though it's visible from the subsidized housing.
Right.
And at some point, when does the designer say, no, I want to do that project?
Right. Yeah.
Okay, I think with that, now that the mic's turned on, we'll say, we'll let Marc go. Please join me in thanking Marc.